Jonah had always dreamed of wide open spaces. Back in Boston, he had lived most of his 32 years in cramped apartments where the city's hum buzzed steadily in the background, day and night. He grew up in a neighborhood of triple-decker houses, where everyone's front stoop was within earshot. Privacy was a luxury, and true quiet was a concept he had rarely experienced. But after his divorce, which crashed into his life like a demolition ball, Jonah found himself driving west in his battered Subaru, an unspoken ache in his chest. He didn't know precisely where he was going, only that he wanted space, a place to breathe, to heal, and to figure out who he was without the constant echoes of heartbreak. His wandering brought him to Wyoming, specifically to Yellowstone National Park. Jonah had never been there before, though he had admired photos of the place since he was a boy, with its geysers shooting columns of steam into the cold air and bison dotting the plains. Upon arrival, the rawness of nature overwhelmed him. He'd grown up around New England's gentle mountains and lakes, but this was different. The scale of it, the sweeping meadows, craggy ridges, and towering pines made him realize how small he was. In a way, that came as a relief. The intricacies of his personal pain were dwarfed by the primal majesty of the wild. At first, Jonah intended only to pass through Yellowstone, to stay a day or two before heading farther west. He booked himself a simple cabin just outside the eastern entrance, a short drive from the main thoroughfares. It was early autumn, and the weather was turning. Crisp breezes rustled the aspen leaves, already touched gold. Tourists were fewer now, and Jonah liked that. It gave him a chance to move quietly, alone, without the chattering crowds that usually accompanied national parks in the summer. He arrived at dusk, the sun sinking behind the mountains. In the dimming light, he parked by a small visitors area, where an older ranger stood near his truck. The ranger had a deeply lined face, a graying beard, and an air of serenity, as though he had seen it all and taken comfort in nature's unstoppable rhythms. The name stitched on his uniform read McAllister. "Visiting, or passing through?" the ranger asked, eyeing Jonah's Massachusetts license plate. A gentle curiosity sparked in his gaze. "Visiting," Jonah replied. "I'm trying to figure out what's next." He gave a short laugh, self-conscious about how vague and aimless that sounded. Ranger McAllister shrugged, as though unfazed by life's big questions. "This is a good place to figure out things," he said. He pointed to the nearly set sun. "But remember, we've got wildlife. You might catch glimpses of bison, maybe elk. And, of course, we have bears. Both black bears and grizzlies roam around here. Be sure to secure your food properly, especially if you're staying outside in a cabin." Jonah had read about the park's precautions. "Got it," he said. "Don't leave anything out that might attract them, right?" "Exactly," McAllister nodded. "And never, ever feed a bear, no matter how tame it seems. That's the golden rule." Jonah flashed a quick smile. "Right, I understand." But on the inside, Jonah's heart twisted a little. There was something in him, maybe the same thing that had once made him adopt a stray dog back in college, that couldn't imagine seeing an animal in need and doing nothing. Despite the heartbreak he was trying to escape, Jonah's kindness had always run deep. He had been known to slip a little extra to a homeless person on the street, help neighbors with groceries, or volunteer at shelters when he had the time. Even now, as he thought of bears, an odd tenderness rustled in his chest. They were powerful and dangerous, yet they too were living beings trying to get by. Jonah pushed the thought aside, promising himself he would abide by the rules of the park. He found his cabin, a modest wood structure with a small porch, chipped paint, and a single window. Inside were a single bed, a kerosene lamp, and a table that wobbled on uneven legs. It smelled faintly of cedar, dust, and damp. Outside, he could hear the wind sighing through the pines. It was quieter than any place Jonah had ever stayed. For the first time in months, the tension in his shoulders began to ease. Over the following days, Jonah settled into a rhythm. He woke early to walk winding trails, that snaked through the forest. Occasionally, he'd catch sight of black-tailed deer bounding through the undergrowth, or see the broad shape of a bison grazing in the meadows. He kept his distance, heart pounding at each close encounter. He carried bear spray on a belt, as recommended, though part of him doubted he'd have the nerve to stand his ground if a grizzly charged him. Mornings he'd hike, evenings he'd return, wash up, and read by the kerosene lamp until his eyes drooped. Every day seemed a little calmer, a little more bearable. He wasn't fixed, divorce scars don't vanish in a week, but the pain was softening, the wilderness acting like a balm. The open sky and unhurried pace invited Jonah to actually feel his emotions rather than bury them. He wrote in a small journal each evening, describing nature scenes or recollecting old memories from childhood. He found that being so close to the wild gave him permission to acknowledge his grief without letting it define him. On the 5th day, he decided to take a trail rarely visited by tourists, one that led to an overlook near the rim of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. It was a few miles beyond the typical vantage points, and Jonah craved the solitude. He walked for hours, listening to birds call overhead and the hush of the wind through lodgepole pines. The sky was milky white with clouds that threatened rain, but Jonah didn't mind. The chance of solitude, even in a drizzle, appealed to him. Near midday, he spotted something on the trail ahead, a solitary black bear. It was small, possibly a juvenile. Jonah's heart stuttered. Every park sign and ranger's caution told him to keep his distance. He reached for the bear spray on his belt, but something made him pause. The bear wasn't acting aggressive. It stood near the trunk of a fallen tree, sniffing around as though searching for edible mushrooms or insects. Its fur was ragged in patches, and its ribs looked a bit pronounced, as though it hadn't managed to pack on enough weight for winter. Even so, Jonah remained cautious. He remembered what to do: speak calmly and firmly, make himself look bigger if necessary, and slowly back away. But as he edged backward, the bear didn't attack or even seem spooked. It lifted its muzzle in Jonah's direction, as though it could smell him. Then it ambled toward him, stopping a respectful distance away, a good 15 feet, its dark eyes fixed on Jonah's pack. Jonah felt an unusual tug of empathy. The bear looked hungry. He knew the official warnings. Do not feed the bears. Never leave out food. Keep your distance. He knew it was for the bear's own good. If bears got too accustomed to humans, they could become dangerous or reliant. But in that instant, something in Jonah resisted that logic. Maybe it was his own heartbreak, or maybe it was his compassion. The bear looked vulnerable, uncertain in the presence of the human. Another week or two might bring snow, and if this bear didn't build enough fat reserves, it could face a harsh winter. Jonah could almost hear the echo of his ex-wife, Caroline, telling him, "Jonah, you can't save everything and everyone." She used to tease him for his soft heart. But right now, in the hush of the forest, confronted by this wild creature in need, Jonah couldn't ignore the stirring in his chest. He carefully pulled a protein bar from his pack. Through all the reading and warnings, a voice in his mind urged him, "Don't do it." But his trembling hands couldn't resist. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I know I shouldn't do this." The bear watched him carefully, not aggressive, not cowering, just watchful. Slowly, Jonah unwrapped the bar and placed it on the ground several feet in front of him. Then he backed up further, giving the bear space. It was a moment, suspended in time. The bear sniffed the air, ambled forward, and quickly devoured the morsel. It was gone in seconds. The bear then raised its head, gazing at Jonah with that silent curiosity. Jonah's heart raced. He feared the bear might want more, might approach, might become aggressive. But it didn't. It lingered a moment longer, as though offering a wordless nod of thanks, before padding away into the trees. Jonah remained there, heart hammering. Only after several minutes passed did he exhale, realizing he had been holding his breath. What had he just done? He felt guilty. The rangers were clear. Feeding wildlife disrupts the balance, endangers both humans and animals. The last thing Jonah wanted was to turn this creature into a problem bear that associated humans with easy meals. Yet he'd done it. Through that single act, he had broken the rule. With a storm of thoughts swirling in his head, Jonah turned back. He didn't continue to the overlook. He felt too conflicted, ashamed, yet also oddly at peace. He had given a hungry bear a bit of nourishment, an act of kindness that might or might not have consequences. That night, the guilt haunted him. In his journal he wrote, "I know I shouldn't have fed it, but I couldn't help it. I felt some kind of kinship, both of us wandering and uncertain. I hope I haven't made things worse for that creature." The next day, he tried to forget about the incident, forcing himself to focus on other trails. But the memory lingered like a secret. He told no one. When he passed Ranger McAllister at a checkpoint the next morning, Jonah felt a flush of shame, fearful the ranger might see the guilt in his eyes. Jonah nodded hello and hurried on. Days passed, and Jonah found a restless determination building in him. He revisited the same trail, half hoping he would not see the bear. But part of him also yearned for a reassuring glimpse that it was still alive, for closure. Each day, he found no trace. The forest was vast, and the bear could be anywhere. For better or worse, that chapter seemed closed. A week later, just as Jonah was thinking of moving on perhaps to Montana, he decided to take one more trip deep into the backcountry. It was a trail that started at a slightly higher elevation, known for meandering down into a scenic valley. He packed enough supplies for 3 days, wanting a final immersion into Yellowstone's wilderness. Maybe, he reasoned, that sense of solitude would help him gather the courage to drive onward and begin the next stage of his life. Early in the trek, the landscape spread wide beneath a brilliant blue sky. The wind carried an early winter chill, sweeping across ridges dotted with evergreens. Jonah felt that old wonder spark in him again, the sense of being humbly small against nature's grandeur. He was halfway through the second day when tragedy struck. While descending a rocky path, Jonah misstepped on a patch of loose scree. He went down hard, sliding and tumbling across jagged rocks, his cry of alarm swallowed by the empty forest. When he finally skidded to a stop, his body felt bruised all over. Pain radiated from his right leg, and when he tried to stand, he couldn't put weight on it. A quick test with trembling hands told him it was likely a fracture. Fear seized him. He was miles from any ranger station, alone and out of cell phone range. He was effectively stranded. He tried to fashion a makeshift splint from a sturdy branch and bandages from his pack. The pain made him dizzy, but adrenaline forced him to keep moving. He tried to hobble forward, though every step was excruciating. After 30 minutes, he knew he wasn't going to get far. Dusk was approaching, and the temperature was dropping. A swirl of panic threatened to overwhelm him. Should he stay put, start a fire, and hope a passing hiker or ranger might see his smoke? The trail wasn't exactly popular, especially in late autumn. The hours passed in agony. He managed to gather a bit of tinder and found a half-sheltered hollow near a boulder. Shivering, he lit a small fire. Darkness crept across the sky, and the forest's hush weighed on him like never before. He wondered if he would be forced to spend the night in the open, with predators possibly prowling around. Despite his fear, Jonah's mind drifted to the people who loved him, his parents back in Massachusetts, worried about him, uncertain of his whereabouts. He thought of Caroline, his ex-wife, the way her smile used to light her face. His chest tightened with sadness, and a tear slipped down his cheek as he realized this might be his last night alive. If he didn't find help, or if the cold, or a predator, found him first. He dozed on and off, the pain making deep sleep impossible. At some point well into the night, he heard a rustle. He jerked awake, heart pounding, uncertain if it was real or just his anxious imagination. The forest lay in deep shadows beyond the sputtering flames. Then he heard a soft huffing sound, something stepping closer. Fear twisted his gut. His hand fumbled for the bear spray. He expected the worst. A shape emerged at the edge of his firelight, and Jonah's heart nearly stopped. A black bear. It stood there, head low, muzzle twitching, as though analyzing the situation. Jonah felt panic. There was no question that a black bear could maul him if it decided to attack, and he was in no shape to defend himself. But then, in the flickering light, Jonah realized something. The bear had ragged patches of fur. It was the same bear he had fed the protein bar to weeks before. Something about the bear's eyes and its stance felt strangely familiar, and Jonah's fear was tinged with disbelief. He kept the bear spray ready, but he didn't aim it yet. His instincts told him to wait. The bear slowly advanced, sniffing the air. The remains of Jonah's small food stash, a piece of dried jerky. Some trail mix lay a few feet away. Jonah wondered if the bear caught the scent. He breathed as calmly as he could, adrenaline making his hands quake. If the bear attacked, he knew he had little chance on his busted leg, but it didn't attack. It shuffled closer, then stopped a couple of feet from Jonah's pack. The reflection of the fire danced in its dark, curious eyes. Jonah's heart thundered. He spoke in a low voice, though it trembled. "Easy now, easy. I'm not here to hurt you." The words served little purpose bears don't understand, but perhaps that calm, steady tone was universal. The bear merely stared. Jonah still had no idea what to do. Feeding it once was a mistake, he thought. I can't feed it again. But behind that rational protest, something else surfaced. This bear might be my only chance at survival, at least in the sense that it was another living being out here. The night was cold, and Jonah was in dire shape. In desperation, he pulled out the small bit of jerky he had left. He didn't throw it at the bear, he placed it near the fire, a couple of feet from himself, carefully. The bear continued to watch. Slowly, it moved forward and snapped up the jerky, chewing in small, deliberate motions. Jonah felt a pang of guilt, but also relief. Maybe it would keep the bear from becoming aggressive. What the bear did next astounded Jonah. Instead of running off, it circled Jonah's makeshift campsite, nose to the ground. Then, it settled itself a few yards away, calmly lying down, as if content to remain near him. To Jonah's bewilderment, the bear seemed strangely docile. The heat of the small fire, or perhaps the memory of that earlier kindness, was enough to keep it from running off. Or maybe it was still hungry. Jonah couldn't be sure. He only knew that he was no longer alone in the dark. Warmth, both emotional and physical, flooded him in that moment. When the night fully claimed the forest, Jonah nodded in and out of an uneasy sleep. Every time he cracked his eyes open, he saw the silhouette of the black bear, unmoving, patiently stationed near the perimeter of the firelight. Its presence was equal parts comfort and terror. Jonah wondered if he was delirious. Eventually, morning's light trickled through the pines. Jonah groaned, his leg throbbing. He checked the remains of his fire. It had burned down to embers, but he still had the means to rekindle it. He drew in a breath. The bear was gone. A twist of disappointment and relief unsettled him. Maybe the events of the night had been a fever dream. He coaxed a small flame back to life and waited, unsure of the plan. By late morning, Jonah was forced to accept he needed to move or risk dying out here. The cold day and the bright sun wouldn't last forever. Summoning all his willpower, he slid his pack onto his shoulders and attempted to hobble forward. He had a vague sense that a ranger station lay, maybe 7 miles further along the ridge. That might as well have been 70 miles on his broken leg, but he had no choice. He inched along slowly, each footstep wrenching a cry from his throat, tears stinging his eyes. Trees blurred past in a haze of pain. The day stretched on. He lost count of how many times he had to stop and collect himself. At one point, as Jonah paused to lean against a tree, he heard movement behind him. Panic flashed across his mind. Another bear? A cougar? He fumbled for the bear spray. But out of the trees stepped the same black bear. Jonah was sure of it. Ragged fur, slender muzzle, a certain familiarity in its stance. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. He expected it to approach aggressively, drawn by the scent of his sweat and blood. Instead, the bear walked on an angle parallel to Jonah's path. It peered over at him once or twice, but it did not come too close. Jonah resumed his agonizing steps, the bear ambling nearby, neither fleeing nor attacking. Hours crawled by in a tortured dance of progress. Jonah found some comfort in the fact that he was not entirely alone. Perhaps the bear was simply hoping for more food. Perhaps it was curious. But each time Jonah paused, the bear paused too, as though waiting. Suddenly, around a bend in the trail, Jonah spotted a precarious stretch of rocky slope. The path had partially collapsed from recent rain. He realized the route was impassable. Fear clutched his heart. If he tried to cross the loose stones, he'd likely fall again. A quick look at the map told him there was an alternate route down the slope, but it would add miles to the trip. Jonah felt tears of frustration burn in his eyes. He wanted to curl into a ball and give up, and that was when he noticed the bear had shuffled off the trail to the left, into a patch of thick brush. It stopped to glance back at him, huffing quietly. Something inside Jonah nudged him to follow. With his teeth clenched in pain, he did so, parting the branches carefully. There, behind the brush, he found a narrow but sturdy animal trail, one that skirted the dangerous rubble. The bear pressed on, and Jonah limped after it, half in shock. The path was winding but navigable, and it allowed them to bypass the collapse altogether. Was the bear leading me? The thought was almost too much to believe, but there it was, forging ahead. Each time Jonah fell behind, it slowed and peered over its shoulder. It was unlike anything Jonah had ever heard about wild bears. The hours stretched into late afternoon, with Jonah battling dizziness, thirst, and searing pain. But he pressed on with the bear leading the way, as though it had become his guide. In another hour, the trees thinned, giving way to a clearer path. In the distance, Jonah glimpsed the tiny shape of a ranger's lookout tower perched against the skyline. Relief coursed through him like a wave. He wasn't far now, if he could just make it before nightfall. He turned to find the bear, wanting to offer some kind of gratitude, though he knew the concept was absurd. But the bear was gone. He spun around, scanning the tree line. Nothing. He wanted to call out to it, though it had no name and no language. The forest was silent. Jonah felt both sorrowful and grateful. Somehow, that bear had guided him when he needed it most, whether intentionally or by mere coincidence. Jonah's chest warmed with the realization that, in an indirect way, that single protein bar weeks before had changed both their fates. If he hadn't offered it food, maybe none of this would have happened. Maybe the bear would have stayed away or acted aggressively. He could have died out here, alone. With renewed determination, Jonah dragged himself toward the ranger tower. The sun dipped low in the sky, painting the horizon with pink and orange streaks. By the time he reached the tower steps, his vision was swimming, his leg pulsing. A young ranger, wide-eyed with alarm, rushed out to help. Within an hour, Jonah was in the back of a rescue vehicle, heading for the nearest medical facility. He spent 3 days at the clinic in a nearby town. X-rays confirmed a fracture that required a cast, and his entire body was bruised from the tumble. Ranger McAllister visited him once, wanting to know the details of his accident. Jonah hesitated before admitting everything. He left out the part about feeding the bear, but he did describe how a black bear had been near him that night, how it had guided him around the collapsed path. McAllister listened quietly, then gave Jonah a contemplative look. "Well," McAllister said, crossing his arms, "we always tell folks not to feed the bears. It's a rule for a reason. But sometimes, life doesn't read the rule book." His voice held no judgment, only a quiet acknowledgement that nature had its mysteries. Jonah found himself fighting tears. "I can't explain why it stayed by me," he said softly. "But it did." McAllister nodded. "You might be one of the luckiest men I've met, in that sense. Or maybe that bear recognized something in you. Hard to say." He gave a gentle shrug. "Don't beat yourself up too much. Just remember, kindness is never wasted." Jonah recovered slowly, each day regaining some strength. But the leg needed time to mend, and he was advised not to travel long distances for a while. He ended up staying in a small lodge near the park for the remainder of the autumn season, the caretaker giving him a discount in exchange for help with odd jobs he could manage on crutches. On quiet evenings, Jonah would stare out at the starlit sky, replaying the events in his mind. He felt an odd connection to that bear, an unspoken bond that had transcended the usual lines between human and wild animal. Over time, he realized the event had ignited a fire in him. Maybe he couldn't precisely define it, but a part of him believed life had given him another chance. He recognized that running away from Boston had been an attempt to escape his pain, but survival, with the help of a wild creature's strange empathy, reminded him that every being, human or animal, sometimes needs a little kindness. Jonah spent the winter and spring in Wyoming. During his free time, he volunteered with local conservation efforts, learning about wildlife management, the complexities of human-animal conflicts, and the importance of keeping bears wild. He worked with rangers, listened to their stories, and in time, he felt a new purpose forming in him, like a green shoot rising through ash. Eventually, he decided to stay for good, renting a small place outside the park. He pursued a ranger certification course, determined to dedicate himself to preserving the land that had helped him find direction again. Occasionally, on crisp mornings, he would remember the black bear's cautious gaze and the hush of that starry night. He'd remember how everyone said, "Don't feed the bear," and how that single rule-breaking act of kindness had ended up saving his life. The memory taught him about the fragility of life, about empathy that reached across species, and about how the smallest gestures can leave deep imprints. Almost a year to the day after he fed that hungry black bear, Jonah found himself on a training patrol, walking a familiar trail. He limped slightly still, his leg ached in the cold air, but he was grateful simply to walk. He halted at the same clearing where, once upon a time, he had paused in disbelief to feed a protein bar to a desperate animal. Then, as though a sign from the wilderness, he noticed fresh bear tracks, a set of prints leading into the trees. For an instant, he wondered if it was that bear. A thrill of awe ran through him. There was no guarantee, of course. Bears roam far and wide, individuals come and go, but the possibility felt like a gift in itself. Jonah smiled. In that moment, he acknowledged the path he had traveled. Heartbreak had brought him west, and impulsive kindness had forged an unlikely connection, and that bond had helped him survive a lonely, perilous night. He realized how far he'd come, no longer defined by the wounds of a broken marriage, no longer a lost soul wandering aimlessly. Instead, he had found a purpose in protecting and understanding nature's delicate dance of life. With a calm breath, Jonah hoisted his pack and followed the trail, the memory of that ragged bear in his heart. He would carry the lesson forward, balanced between caution and compassion. Indeed, the ranger's rule still held. True wild bears should stay wild. But Jonah also knew that sometimes, in those rare moments on the edge of survival, a spark of kindness might bridge the divide between man and beast. And that spark had guided him to a new life, one of resilience, connection, and a deep respect for the bonds that link us all.